So we're going to start by talking about why mental health is such an important problem. And the long and the short of it is that it affects a huge number of people, particularly in Australia, and people who are affected by it are affected very deeply compared to many other things that might surprise you. So this presents itself as a major societal and global problem to address, but that also means it's a really good opportunity for exercise physiologists. As we'll learn, exercise physiologists are a critical component of the holistic treatment of people with mental health conditions. And it's a really big opportunity for them to have an impact on the health and well-being of a really large number of people. So there is going to be a few statistics, but I really want to help you understand the scope of the problem and how important this is as a place to contribute. So the WHO say depression is ranked as the single largest contributor to global disability. Think about that. It's bigger than malaria, it's bigger than cardiovascular disease, it's bigger than cancer. Depression is the biggest cause of disability. And that's interesting because depression is only one of a series of mental illnesses and mental health conditions that are causing disability worldwide. So how is this? How is it that depression is such a big problem? Well, let's start by figuring out what they mean by causing disability. And so that you understand the rest of the statistics here, we're going to talk about two components to how we measure disability. So the main measurement is called a DALY, or a Disability Adjusted Life Year. So if you take this timeline as being people's lives, there's two ways that an illness can really cause someone to suffer. As you can see, throughout your life, you're going to have periods of disease or disability. A purple patch might be an area where you've broken an arm and you're stuck in a cast, or you've had a knee operation and you're out for a little while. But there's another way, which is it can cause premature death. You can have somebody in their 50s or 60s who dies of cancer and heart disease, and it's a tragedy because there's this whole section of their life that they weren't able to live, even though they were expected to live that long. So if someone dies at 50, you're losing 30 years maybe on their expected life in a wealthy country like Australia. So there are two ways that an illness can cause disability. One is it can interfere with people's lives while they're alive, and two, it can shorten their life. And so these are the two components that we'll talk about here. So there's the years lived with disability, is basically how much does the disease ruin people's lives while they're walking around, and years of life lost is how likely is it that this is going to cause premature death in somebody. So a disability adjusted life year measures the overall burden of disease, and that's combining the years lived with disability and the years of life lost. So let's have a look at an example, which is the disability adjusted life years of Australians as a result of mental illness. So I'm going to walk you through a number of graphs to try to describe the size and scope of the problem, particularly with an Australian context in mind, because I think, first of all, the data speaks more loudly than the words, and two, I want you to be able to sort of critically interpret some of the statistics that you might be told. So this is the number of people who are having disability adjusted life years, so their either lives are being inhibited or they're losing their lives as a result of mental illnesses, and this is all mental illness combined. And you can see over the last 30 or so years, the number of sort of people who have experienced mental illness has increased, but this is where sometimes statistics can be deceptive. This is looking at the total number, but if you control for the increase in population, there actually hasn't been that much of a change. So now if we look at the rate, which is sort of adjusting per 100,000 people, you can see that there hasn't actually been a radical change. And that's kind of surprising because there's been a whole lot more interest in the media for mental illness, and it is getting a whole lot more traction in the public. So there isn't necessarily an increase in mental disorders, and that might be because it's just starting to become more mainstream and normalized that it's okay to talk about this as something we need to fix. It's also interesting because we're getting better at dealing with a lot of disorders. A lot of diseases around the world are starting to become more easily treated. So this is the disease burden from communicable maternal neonatal or nutritional diseases. Things like diarrhea and malaria. And you can see the total burden of disease in the last 30 years has plummeted for a lot of these. Now, there's still a lot of people who are suffering as a result of AIDS, for example, but it's getting better compared to when it was at its peak. And we're dealing globally with a lot of these problems, but as you can tell, we're not dealing well with mental illness. So this graph is fairly confusing, but I'm just going to walk through it and then help you understand why this tells us so much about what's important when it comes to mental illness. So this is the number of disability adjusted life years by a whole lot of different diseases. And you can see that still around the world, malaria, diarrhea, neonatal disorders are causing a whole lot of problems. Now, most of that is because in developing countries, there's still quite a big proportion of extreme poverty. And as a result, there's a lot of people who are struggling with what we know as treatable disorders. So let's just have a look at Australia and watch what happens to the percentage of disability that's accounted for by depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, and other mental health conditions. So if we change this to Australia, notice how the amount of disability caused by depression increases. And now we're talking a substantial part of the population, okay? And as you can see, the number of people who are dying from diarrhea is much, much smaller. So this is accounting both from disability that's accounted for by early loss of life as well as suffering throughout life. Whereas if you just look at the years lived with the disability, which is basically a proxy for how much suffering is this disease causing, you can see that now mental illness takes up a huge chunk of the pie. As does chronic pain, which is another area that EPs and psychologists work to try to treat. So it's a little bit hard to visualize what percentage of the disability is associated with mental illness. And this chart, I think, explains it a little bit better. And you can see from this that Australia has the biggest share of population with mental health or substance abuse disorders in the world. About 18% of Australians are struggling with a mental health or substance use disorder. So how does this vary by sort of different disorders? Well, this is globally. You can see the most common type of disorder is an anxiety disorder, then depression, then alcohol use, then drug abuse. And schizophrenia, eating disorders, and bipolar disorder are relatively low compared to anxiety disorders and depression. So if we have a look at how we compare on each of those disorders, you can see Australia is amongst the highest levels of depression in the world, with approximately 4.5% of Australians having depression. The same for anxiety. There's about 6 or 7% of Australians have anxiety, and again, that's amongst the highest countries in the world. Bipolar disorder, Australia and New Zealand are both very high when it comes to having bipolar, and with an eating disorder, Australia is the highest in the world. Similarly, with schizophrenia, we also have some of the highest rates of schizophrenia in the world. And as you can see from the note here, these are trying to account for the true estimate, not just the reported diagnosis. So as you can imagine, the number of people getting picked up with schizophrenia, as in the sort of diagnosis rate, it may be higher in the Western world than it is in parts of Africa. And this is trying to account for that as well, and we're still amongst the highest. One of the strange statistics about this, though, is that when you look at life satisfactions, Australians are very happy with their lives. You can see we have high levels of life satisfaction compared to most other countries, similar to Northern European countries and Canada, and higher than the US and India and France and Spain and Italy. So how is it that we end up having high levels of life satisfaction, yet some of the worst levels of mental health and substance use disorders? Well, there's a whole lot of factors that go into that, but one of them is that we often tend to judge our happiness based on our relative position compared to other people, not necessarily just where we sit on the absolute scale. So if we live in a lucky, happy country where everyone else is happy and having a good time, and we're struggling, that might make it personally very difficult to deal with, compared to if you're in a community where a whole lot of people are sort of struggling together. The causes of mental health condition are complex, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can understand what's going on with a mental health condition a little later on in the course. But let's summarize what we've learned about how mental health affects the global population and Australia, and how that leads to an important opportunity for exercise physiologists. So in total, globally, there's 792 million people living with a mental illness. Mental illness is incredibly disabling, and the level of disability associated with something like depression is more than blindness or paraplegia. So when people are living with these disorders, it's almost worse. People rate their lives as being worse when they have depression than if they're blind, than if they're in a wheelchair. Severe depression is rated as being worse than being permanently confined to bed. So having a mental illness, particularly having depression, is really debilitating. And there are so many people struggling with these disorders. And so if we look at the disease burden in Australia, the things that cause disability, 30% of that is from mental health alone. Now, it's not the leading cause of death. Cancer and heart disease are, but people with mental illness are more likely to be sedentary. They're more likely to develop those conditions. And exercise is a bit of a panacea when it comes to all of these. As we know, exercise is a powerful prevention strategy for trying to reduce the effects of heart disease and the effects that that has on premature death. And as we'll talk about today, exercise can also be a powerful way to try to reduce this disease burden from mental illness.